In the depths of the Pacific Ocean, where sunlight never reaches and only the bravest souls dare to venture, there exists a submarine crew unlike any other. Among them walks a woman whose very presence defies every military tradition, every regulation, and every unwritten rule of naval warfare. She wears an emblem that should have gotten her court-martialed, imprisoned, or worse. Yet when Admiral Harrison first laid eyes on her kill count, his shouted orders died in his throat, replaced by something he had never felt in 30 years of service. Genuine fear mixed with undeniable respect. This is the story of Lieutenant Sarah Ghost Chen, the woman who turned the most forbidden symbol in naval history into a badge of honor, and how a single submarine mission in enemy waters would change everything the Navy thought they knew about warfare, sacrifice, and the thin line between heroism and madness. The steel corridors of the USS Leviathan hummed with the familiar vibration of diesel engines pushing the massive submarine through the dark waters of the South China Sea. It was 0600 hours when Admiral David Harrison stepped aboard the vessel, his polished boots echoing against the metal deck plates as he made his way through the narrow passageways. At 58 years old, Harrison had seen more naval action than most men could stomach, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to encounter. The Admiral had received disturbing reports from Fleet Command, whispers of a submarine crew operating outside normal protocols, of a lieutenant who had somehow accumulated an impossible kill count while wearing unauthorized insignia. The reports seemed too bizarre to be true, but Harrison had learned long ago that the most unbelievable stories often contained the most dangerous truths. Lieutenant Sarah Chen was working in the torpedo room when the Admiral found her. She stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, her black hair pulled back in a regulation bun. But there was something about her presence that made the cramped space feel even smaller. She was calibrating the guidance systems on a Mark 48 torpedo with the kind of precision that spoke of countless hours of practice. Her movements were fluid, methodical, almost meditative. It was then that Harrison saw it. Sewn onto her uniform, where a standard naval insignia should have been, was a small black patch depicting a skull with crossed bones beneath it. Not the playful pirate symbol that might adorn a Halloween costume, but something darker, more personal. The skull's eye sockets seemed to stare directly at whoever looked upon it, and beneath the crossed bones were tiny marks that Harrison couldn't quite make out from his position. "Lieutenant Chen!" Harrison's voice boomed through the torpedo room, causing several nearby sailors to jump. Sarah turned slowly, her dark eyes meeting the Admiral's gaze without a hint of fear or surprise. She came to attention with military precision, but she made no move to hide or explain the forbidden emblem on her chest. "That emblem is forbidden," Harrison shouted, his face flushing red with anger. "What in the hell do you think you're doing wearing unauthorized insignia on a United States Navy vessel?" The entire torpedo room fell silent. Sailors who had been working on various tasks stopped what they were doing and watched the confrontation unfold. This was the kind of moment that could end careers, the kind of insubordination that led to court-martials and dishonorable discharges. Yet Sarah Chen stood perfectly still, her expression calm and unreadable. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice carrying despite its low volume, "I have authorization for this insignia from Captain Morrison." Harrison's eyes narrowed. He had served with Captain Morrison for over a decade and knew the man to be a stickler for regulations. There was no way Morrison would authorize such a blatant violation of uniform standards. "Show me the authorization, Lieutenant." Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to the Admiral without breaking eye contact. Harrison unfolded the document and began to read, his expression growing more confused with each line. The paper was indeed signed by Captain Morrison, but it contained language he had never seen in an official military document. Special authorization granted to Lieutenant Sarah Chen for the wearing of personal insignia in recognition of extraordinary service beyond the call of duty. Harrison read aloud. Said insignia serves as both recognition of achievement and psychological warfare tool against enemy forces. The Admiral looked up from the paper, his anger temporarily replaced by bewilderment. Psychological warfare tool? What the hell does that mean? Sarah remained at attention, but something shifted in her posture. The other sailors in the torpedo room seemed to sense it too, an almost imperceptible change in the atmosphere. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" "Granted." "The emblem serves as a record, sir. Each mark beneath the crossed bones represents an enemy vessel destroyed. The enemy has learned to recognize it, to fear it. When they see this symbol, they know death is coming." Harrison stared at her for a long moment, then looked more closely at the patch on her uniform. What he had initially taken for decorative elements beneath the skull and crossbones were actually tiny notches, each one carefully embroidered in silver thread. He began counting them, and as the numbers climbed higher, his anger slowly transformed into something else entirely. 10 notches. 20. 30. The count kept climbing until Harrison lost track, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Each notch represented a confirmed kill, an enemy vessel sent to the bottom of the ocean. The number was impossible, unprecedented. No single officer in the modern Navy had a kill count even approaching what he was looking at. "How many?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the submarine's ambient noise. 47 confirmed kills, sir. 12 destroyers, 18 frigates, 9 submarines, 5 cruisers, and 3 aircraft carriers. The torpedo room remained absolutely silent. Even the usual sounds of the submarine seemed muted, as if the vessel itself was holding its breath. Harrison had commanded naval operations for 3 decades, had overseen some of the most successful military campaigns in recent history, but he had never heard numbers like these from a single officer. "That's impossible," Harrison whispered, more to himself than to Sarah. "No one has numbers like that." Sarah finally broke her rigid posture slightly, just enough to tilt her head toward the Admiral. "Sir, with respect, the impossible is what we do here. The crew of the Leviathan operates in waters where the impossible is just Tuesday morning." For the first time since boarding the submarine, Admiral Harrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean depths surrounding them. He looked around the torpedo room and noticed that every sailor present was watching Sarah with a mixture of respect and something that looked almost like reverence. These were hardened military men, veterans of multiple deployments, yet they looked at this small woman as if she was something beyond their understanding. "Show me your service record," Harrison commanded, his voice hoarse. Sarah nodded to one of the nearby sailors, who immediately produced a thick folder from a nearby cabinet. The Admiral opened it and began reading, his eyes widening with each page. Mission after mission, each one documented with clinical precision. Enemy vessels engaged and destroyed, impossible odds overcome, objectives achieved that other crews had failed to accomplish. The pattern was always the same. The Leviathan would be sent to handle situations that other submarines couldn't or wouldn't take on. Heavily defended enemy positions, impossible extraction missions, surgical strikes against targets that seemed untouchable. And in every case, Lieutenant Sarah Chen was at the center of the operation, her tactical genius and ruthless efficiency turning certain defeat into overwhelming victory. But it was the personal notes from Captain Morrison that truly caught Harrison's attention. Comments about Sarah's uncanny ability to predict enemy movements, her almost supernatural understanding of underwater acoustics, her capacity to remain calm under pressure that would break other officers. Morrison wrote about her like she was less a human being and more a force of nature, something that the ocean itself had created for the specific purpose of naval warfare. "Sir," said one of the sailors, a grizzled petty officer with 20 years of service, "Lieutenant Chen saved this boat more times than we can count. That patch she wears, it's not just decoration." Enemy subs had been known to surface and surrender when they realized they're facing the ghost. "The ghost?" Harrison asked. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but several of the sailors smiled grimly. "That's what the enemy calls her, sir," the petty officer continued. "They've got legends about her in their fleet. Stories about a demon who haunts the deep water, who can appear anywhere, anytime, and send entire battle groups to the bottom without warning." Harrison closed the service record folder and looked back at Sarah. The forbidden emblem on her chest no longer seemed like a violation of regulations. Instead, it looked like exactly what she had claimed it was: a record of achievement and a weapon of psychological warfare. If enemy forces truly had learned to fear that symbol, then it represented a strategic advantage worth far more than adherence to uniform standards. But something still bothered him about the situation. The numbers were too high, the success rate too perfect. In his experience, war was chaotic, unpredictable. Even the best officers suffered defeats, made mistakes, lost battles. Yet Sarah Chen's record showed an unbroken string of victories that defied statistical probability. "Lieutenant," Harrison said slowly, "in 30 years of naval service, I've never seen anything like your record. How do you explain your success rate?" For the first time since their conversation began, Sarah's perfectly controlled expression showed a flicker of something deeper. Her eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the metal walls of the torpedo room, something that only she could see. "Sir," she said quietly, "some of us are born for this. The ocean speaks to some people differently than others. I listen to what it tells me, and I act accordingly." The Admiral felt another chill, stronger this time. There was something in Sarah's tone, something in her eyes, that suggested depths he couldn't begin to fathom. He had commanded thousands of sailors over the years, had worked with some of the most talented officers in the Navy, but he had never encountered anyone quite like Lieutenant Sarah Chen. As he prepared to leave the torpedo room, Harrison made a decision that would change everything. Instead of ordering Sarah to remove the forbidden emblem, instead of writing her up for insubordination, he was going to do something unprecedented. He was going to watch her work to see for himself whether the stories about the ghost were true. "Lieutenant Chen," he said formally, "I want you to brief me on your current mission parameters. I'll be observing your operations for the next 48 hours. Sarah nodded once, a sharp, precise movement. "Understood, sir. I should warn you that our current assignment is what Captain Morrison classifies as a Category 5 operation." "Category 5? Maximum difficulty, sir. The kind of mission that typically doesn't have survivors." As Admiral Harrison left the torpedo room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to witness something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about naval warfare, about the limits of human capability, and about the thin line between heroism and something far darker. 18 hours later, Admiral Harrison stood in the control room of the USS Leviathan, watching Lieutenant Sarah Chen orchestrate what could only be described as underwater ballet. The submarine was currently running silent at a depth of 800 feet, deep in enemy territorial waters, where detection meant certain death. Yet Sarah moved through the cramped space with the confidence of someone taking a leisurely stroll through a park. The mission briefing had been unlike anything Harrison had experienced in his decades of service. Captain Morrison had laid out an operation that seemed designed by someone with a death wish. The Leviathan was tasked with infiltrating the heavily defended Scarlet Harbor, where enemy forces maintained their most critical naval installation. Intelligence suggested that a new class of nuclear submarine was being tested there, a vessel that could potentially shift the balance of power in the entire region. The objective was simple in concept but impossible in execution. Get close enough to the testing facility to plant listening devices that would allow fleet intelligence to monitor the new submarine's capabilities, then escape without detection. Previous attempts by other submarines had resulted in complete losses. 3 boats had been sent on similar missions over the past year. None had returned. "Sir," whispered the sonar operator, a young sailor whose hands trembled slightly as he monitored his equipment. "I'm picking up multiple contacts. Looks like a full patrol pattern, at least 6 vessels." Sarah moved to the sonar station without making a sound, her movements so fluid they barely registered on the submarine's sensitive motion detectors. She studied the display for perhaps 10 seconds, her eyes tracking patterns that Harrison couldn't even see, then turned to the helmsman. "Bring us to bearing 270, down angle 5 degrees, she commanded quietly. "Reduce speed to 3 knots. The helmsman immediately complied, but Harrison felt compelled to speak up. "Lieutenant, that bearing takes us directly into the patrol pattern. Shouldn't we be moving away from those contacts?" Sarah turned to look at him, and for a moment, Harrison saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. It was the look of a predator that had spotted prey, the calculating gaze of something that belonged more to the depths of the ocean than to the surface world. "Sir, with respect, those patrol boats are following a pattern established by their naval doctrine. They expect threats to come from the most logical approach routes, so they focus their attention on those areas. The last place they'll look for an enemy submarine is directly beneath their formation." The Admiral watched in fascination and growing unease as the Leviathan slipped through the water like a ghost, moving with impossible precision through gaps in the enemy patrol pattern that Harrison couldn't even see. Sarah seemed to know exactly where each enemy vessel would be at any given moment, as if she had access to their navigation systems. "How does she do it?" he whispered to Captain Morrison, who had been standing silently beside the periscope. Morrison's weathered face showed a mixture of pride and something that might have been fear. "Admiral, I've been serving with Lieutenant Chen for 3 years, and I still don't understand it completely. She has an intuitive grasp of underwater tactics that goes beyond anything I've seen in 4 decades of naval service. It's like she can see the entire battlefield in her mind, every vessel, every current, every sound." As if to prove Morrison's point, Sarah suddenly raised her hand, signaling for complete silence. The entire control room froze, every sailor holding his breath as they waited for her next command. She stood perfectly still for nearly a minute, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. "Contact bearing 090, she said quietly. "Nuclear submarine, probably their new prototype. Distance approximately 4,000 yards, depth 600 feet, speed 8 knots. The sonar operator checked his equipment frantically adjusting settings and filters, but shook his head. "Ma'am, I'm not detecting anything on that bearing." Sarah moved to the sonar station and made a series of rapid adjustments to the equipment. Suddenly, the display showed exactly what she had described, a faint contact moving on the precise bearing and speed she had specified. The sonar operator stared at his screen in amazement. "How did you know, ma'am?" "The water carries information if you know how to listen to it," Sarah replied simply. "That submarine has a slight hull resonance at low frequencies, probably due to their new reactor design. Most sonar systems filter out those low-frequency sounds as background noise." Admiral Harrison felt his respect for the young lieutenant climbing towards something approaching awe. He had worked with some of the most talented naval officers in the fleet, but Sarah Chen operated on a level that seemed almost supernatural. She wasn't just good at her job. She was redefining what was possible in submarine warfare. The next several hours passed in a state of controlled tension as the Leviathan maneuvered deeper into enemy territory. Sarah guided the submarine through increasingly complex defensive networks with an ease that defied explanation. She seemed to know instinctively when to go shallow to avoid bottom-mounted sensors, when to dive deep to escape acoustic detection, when to speed up and when to crawl. It was during the approach to Scarlet Harbor itself that Harrison truly began to understand why enemy forces had learned to fear the symbol on Sarah's chest. The harbor was protected by what intelligence described as an impenetrable defensive network: submarine nets, acoustic sensors, patrol boats, aircraft and shore-based missile batteries. It was the kind of defensive setup that should have made covert infiltration impossible. Yet Sarah studied the defensive pattern for less than 20 minutes before announcing her plan. "We're going in through the main shipping channel," she said calmly. Every officer in the control room turned to stare at her. The main shipping channel was the most heavily monitored approach to the harbor, constantly patrolled by enemy vessels and covered by multiple sensor arrays. "Lieutenant," Captain Morrison said carefully, "that approach is suicide. Intelligence estimates a 90% probability of detection within the first mile of the channel." Sarah moved to the navigation table and began plotting a course with quick, precise movements. "Sir, conventional wisdom says that approach is suicide. But conventional wisdom assumes that the enemy can predict our behavior. What if we do something so unexpected that their defensive systems aren't designed to handle it?" She pointed to a section of the chart showing the deepest part of the shipping channel. At 1400 hours, the harbor master allows passage for their largest cargo vessels. During that window, they shut down their acoustic sensors to avoid interference with the ship's sonar systems. "We have exactly 18 minutes to reach the inner harbor, while hiding in the acoustic shadow of a cargo ship." Harrison studied the plan and felt his military instincts screaming warnings. The timing would have to be perfect, the navigation flawless. Any mistake would put them directly in the path of an incoming cargo vessel or expose them to detection by multiple enemy sensors. "The margin for error is essentially zero," he pointed out.
"Yes, sir," Sarah agreed. "That's what makes it perfect. The execution of the plan was nothing short of miraculous."
Sarah positioned the Leviathan directly beneath a massive enemy cargo vessel, using its hull to mask their presence from surface sensors while riding in the acoustic shadow created by its massive engines. The submarine maintained a depth of just 40 feet below the cargo ship's keel, close enough that a minor navigation error would result in a collision that would destroy both vessels. Harrison watched in fascination as Sarah made constant micro-adjustments to their position, keeping the Leviathan in the perfect spot to remain hidden while the cargo ship unwittingly escorted them through the defensive perimeter. It was like watching a master surgeon perform an operation, every movement calculated and precise. "How do you maintain position so accurately?" he asked quietly. "The cargo ship creates predictable water displacement patterns," Sarah explained without taking her eyes off the navigation display. "If you understand fluid dynamics well enough, you can use those patterns to maintain relative position without relying on active sensors." When they finally reached the inner harbor, Sarah guided the submarine to a position near the testing facility with the same impossible precision. The Leviathan settled onto the harbor floor at a depth of 200 feet, its hull coming to rest in the shadow of a massive concrete pier that would hide them from most detection methods. The mission to plant the listening devices went flawlessly. A small team of specialized divers slipped out of the submarine and placed the equipment exactly where intelligence had specified. They returned within 2 hours, reporting no signs of detection by enemy forces. But it was during their escape from the harbor that Harrison witnessed something that would haunt him for years to come. As the Leviathan began its withdrawal from Scarlet Harbor, enemy forces suddenly appeared to discover their presence. Alarms began sounding across the harbor, and patrol boats started moving in search patterns that would eventually locate the submarine. It seemed that despite their perfect infiltration, something had gone wrong. "Contact!" the sonar operator called out. "Multiple surface vessels converging on our position. They know we're here." Harrison felt his heart rate spike as he realized they were trapped. The shipping channel they had used to enter the harbor was now blocked by enemy patrol boats, and the alternative routes were covered by aircraft dropping sonobuoys into the water. But Sarah Chen appeared completely calm, as if she had expected this development. She moved to the weapons control station and began what could only be described as a deadly chess game, played with torpedoes and enemy vessels.
"Fire control solution on target bearing 045, she commanded. "Mark 48 torpedo, minimum yield, magnetic detonator."
"Ma'am," the weapons officer replied nervously, "firing will reveal our exact position to every enemy unit in the harbor." Sarah's smile was cold and predatory.
"That's exactly what I'm counting on." The torpedo launched silently, its wake invisible to surface observers. 30 seconds later, an enemy patrol boat on the far side of the harbor exploded in a massive fireball that lit up the night sky. Immediately, every enemy vessel in the area turned toward the explosion, assuming the submarine was in that location. While the enemy forces converged on the false position, Sarah guided the Leviathan in the opposite direction, using the confusion and the acoustic interference from the explosion to mask their movement. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, using the enemy's own tactical doctrine against them. But the real demonstration of her capabilities came when an enemy submarine, apparently the new prototype they had been sent to observe, appeared on sonar and began actively hunting the Leviathan. "Nuclear submarine, bearing 180, range 3,000 yards, the sonar operator reported. "She's pinging actively, trying to get a firing solution." Sarah studied the sonar display for a moment, then began issuing a series of rapid commands that transformed the control room into a perfectly choreographed dance of destruction. "Helm, come to bearing 220, speed 15 knots. Dive to 400 feet. Weapons, prepare tubes 1 and 3. Mark 48 torpedoes, enable wire guidance." The enemy submarine was faster and more advanced than the Leviathan, but Sarah turned that advantage against them. She used the terrain of the harbor floor, the thermal layers in the water, and even the noise from surface vessels to create a three-dimensional maze that confused the enemy's senses. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes, but Harrison knew he was witnessing something unprecedented. Sarah fought the enemy submarine like a grandmaster, playing chess against a novice, always 3 moves ahead, always in control of the engagement. When it ended, the enemy submarine was sinking to the harbor floor with a massive hole torn in its pressure hull, while the Leviathan escaped into open ocean without sustaining any damage. As they cleared the harbor defenses and headed for friendly waters, Admiral Harrison found himself staring at Lieutenant Sarah Chen with a mixture of admiration and something approaching fear. He had just witnessed a level of tactical genius that redefined what he thought was possible in naval warfare. But more than that, he had seen something in Sarah's eyes during the battle, something that suggested she wasn't just exceptionally skilled at submarine warfare. She seemed to take a genuine pleasure in the destruction, a satisfaction that went beyond professional competence. As the Leviathan sailed through the dark waters toward their home port, Harrison couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something that would change naval warfare forever. The question that troubled him was whether that change would be for better or for worse. The journey back to home port should have been a time for celebration, but Admiral Harrison found himself increasingly troubled by what he had witnessed. As the USS Leviathan sailed through international waters under cover of darkness, he spent his time reviewing mission reports, crew evaluations, and trying to understand exactly what Lieutenant Sarah Chen represented for the future of naval warfare. The mission had been an unqualified success by every metric that mattered. They had penetrated one of the most heavily defended enemy installations in the world, gathered critical intelligence, and eliminated a prototype submarine that could have shifted the balance of power in the region. Any other officer would be receiving commendations and promotions for such an achievement, but something about Sarah's methods disturbed Harrison on a fundamental level. Her tactical genius was undeniable, but there was a ruthlessness to her approach that seemed to cross lines he had never seen crossed before. During the battle in Scarlet Harbor, she had destroyed the enemy submarine with a precision that suggested she took genuine pleasure in the act of killing. 3 days into their return journey, Harrison requested a private meeting with Captain Morrison in his quarters. The older officer looked tired, as if the weight of commanding such an unusual crew was taking its toll on him. "Admiral," Morrison began before Harrison could speak, "I know what you're thinking. I had the same concerns when Lieutenant Chen first reported for duty." "Then why do you continue to employ her methods?" Harrison asked bluntly. Morrison poured himself a cup of coffee and stared out the small porthole at the dark ocean beyond. Because they work, sir. In 3 years of operations, Lieutenant Chen has never lost a mission, never lost a crew member, never failed to achieve her objectives. Her success rate is literally unprecedented in naval history. But at what cost? Harrison pressed. I've been reviewing her psychological evaluations. The report suggests someone who has developed an unhealthy relationship with combat. Someone who might be losing touch with the human cost of warfare. Admiral, with respect, you've never served in the deep waters where we operate. Out here, conventional thinking gets people killed. Lieutenant Chen understands that better than anyone. Harrison pulled out a folder containing Sarah's complete service record, including classified documents that painted a disturbing picture of her psychological profile. According to these reports, she shows signs of what psychologists are calling adaptive sociopathy, an ability to completely disconnect from emotional consequences while maintaining tactical effectiveness. Morrison set down his coffee cup and looked directly at Harrison. Sir, do you want to know the real story behind Lieutenant Chen's recruitment? I assumed she came through normal channels. She didn't. Morrison moved to a locked cabinet and retrieved another folder, this one bearing classification markings that Harrison had never seen before. Sarah Chen was recruited through a program that doesn't officially exist, a project designed to identify individuals with specific psychological and intellectual profiles that make them exceptionally effective at submarine warfare. Harrison opened the folder and began reading, his expression growing more troubled with each page. The program was called Operation Deep Hunter, and it represented a systematic attempt to identify and train officers who could operate effectively in the psychological isolation and moral ambiguity of modern submarine warfare. They're creating weapons out of people, Harrison said quietly. They're creating tools for a kind of warfare that most people can't handle, Morrison corrected. Sir, you've seen what Lieutenant Chen can accomplish. In a world where conflicts are increasingly fought beneath the ocean's surface, we need people who can think and act without the limitations that constrain normal officers. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Morrison called for whoever it was to enter, and Lieutenant Sarah Chen stepped into the quarters. She moved with the same fluid precision Harrison had observed in the torpedo room, but now there was something different about her presence. Something that made the small space feel charged with potential energy. Sir, she addressed Morrison, we have a situation. What kind of situation? Harrison asked. Sarah turned to look at him, and once again he saw that predatory intelligence in her eyes. Admiral, our escape from Scarlet Harbor was detected by enemy intelligence. They've dispatched a hunter-killer group to intercept us before we reach friendly waters. Harrison felt his blood run cold. A hunter-killer group represented the most serious threat a submarine could face. Multiple vessels working in coordination to track and destroy a single target. It was the kind of opposition that even the most advanced submarines struggled to survive. How many vessels? Morrison asked. Intelligence suggests 4 submarines and 6 surface vessels, sir. They've established a search grid that covers our most likely approach routes to home port. Harrison stared at the young lieutenant, trying to read her expression. Most officers would be showing signs of stress when delivering such dire news, but Sarah appeared completely calm, almost as if she welcomed the challenge. What are our options? Morrison asked. Sarah moved to the navigation chart mounted on the wall and began pointing to various locations. Conventional doctrine would suggest we alter course, attempt to avoid contact until we can reach the protection of our own fleet. But that approach has a low probability of success given the size of the search grid. And unconventional doctrine? Harrison asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to hear the answer. Sarah's smile was cold and calculating. We hunt them before they hunt us. The briefing that followed was unlike anything Admiral Harrison had experienced in his decades of naval service. Sarah laid out a plan that was simultaneously brilliant and terrifying, a tactical approach that turned the traditional submarine warfare doctrine completely on its head. Instead of attempting to evade the hunter-killer group, she proposed to systematically eliminate each vessel, using their own search pattern against them. It was a plan that required perfect timing, flawless execution, and a willingness to take risks that would normally be considered suicidal. Lieutenant, Harrison said carefully, what you're describing is essentially a one-submarine assault on a coordinated naval task force. The odds against success are astronomical. Yes, sir, Sarah agreed. That's exactly what makes it perfect. The execution of the plan began 6 hours later, as the Leviathan approached the edge of the enemy search grid. Sarah had positioned the submarine in what appeared to be empty ocean, But Harrison soon realized that she had chosen their location with the same precision she brought to every other aspect of submarine warfare. Contact bearing 270. The sonar operator reported. Enemy submarine, probably a nuclear attack boat. Sarah moved to the weapons control station and began orchestrating what could only be described as a symphony of destruction. The first enemy submarine never knew what hit it. Sarah's torpedo struck it amidships while it was focused on searching another sector of the grid, sending it to the bottom before it could transmit a warning to the other vessels. But instead of attempting to escape after the first kill, Sarah did something that defied every principle of submarine warfare. She deliberately revealed the Leviathan's position to the remaining enemy vessels. "Ma'am," the communications officer said nervously, "the enemy task force is converging on our position. All remaining vessels are heading directly for us." Sarah's expression showed the same cold satisfaction that Harrison had observed during the battle at Scarlet Harbor. "Perfect. Now they're exactly where I want them." What followed was the most complex naval engagement Admiral Harrison had ever witnessed. Sarah used the Leviathan's superior maneuverability and her own tactical genius to turn the enemy's numerical advantage into a disadvantage. She positioned the submarine in ways that forced the enemy vessels to interfere with each other's sonar, created acoustic shadows that confused their targeting systems, and used their own aggressive tactics against them. One by one, the enemy vessels fell to the Leviathan's torpedoes. Sarah destroyed them with a methodical efficiency that was both impressive and deeply disturbing. She showed no hesitation, no mercy, no indication that she understood the human cost of what she was doing. When it was over, 9 enemy vessels lay on the ocean floor, and the USS Leviathan continued its journey home without sustaining any significant damage. It was a victory that would be studied in naval academies for decades to come, a tactical masterpiece that redefined what was possible in submarine warfare. But as Admiral Harrison watched Lieutenant Sarah Chen update the kill count on her forbidden emblem, adding 9 more notches to the already impressive tally, he realized that he was witnessing something that went far beyond military excellence. He was watching the emergence of a new kind of warrior, one adapted for a world where traditional concepts of honor and humanity had become liabilities. During the final day of their journey, Harrison requested another private meeting with Sarah. This time, he wanted to understand the person behind the tactical genius, to see if there was still something recognizably human beneath the surface. "Lieutenant," he began carefully, "I've reviewed your entire service record, and I have to ask, do you ever feel any remorse for the lives you've taken?" Sarah considered the question for a long moment, her dark eyes focused on something beyond the metal walls of the submarine. "Admiral, remorse is a luxury that submarine commanders can't afford. Every enemy vessel I destroy represents lives saved on our side, objectives achieved, missions completed successfully."
That's not what I asked. I know what you asked, sir.
Sarah's voice remained steady, but there was something in her tone that suggested depths Harrison couldn't begin to fathom. "You want to know if I'm still human enough to feel guilty about being good at my job?" Harrison leaned forward, studying her face for any sign of the emotion that should have been there. "Are you?" "Sir, I stopped being the person I was before the war a long time ago. The ocean changes you, shapes you into something that can survive in the depths. The question isn't whether I'm still human, the question is whether humanity can afford to have people like me defending it." The conversation ended there, but Harrison continued to think about Sarah's words during the remaining hours of their journey. When the USS Leviathan finally reached home port, he found himself faced with a decision that would affect not just his own career, but potentially the future of naval warfare itself. The mission had been a complete success. Lieutenant Sarah Chen had once again proven her exceptional value to the fleet. Her methods had saved lives, achieved objectives, and demonstrated tactical capabilities that redefined what was possible in submarine warfare. By every measurable standard, she deserved commendation and promotion. But Admiral Harrison couldn't shake the feeling that in creating officers like Sarah Chen, the Navy had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. They had created weapons out of people, turned human beings into instruments of war so efficient that they had lost touch with their own humanity. As he prepared his official report on the mission, Harrison faced a choice. He could recommend Sarah for promotion, ensuring that her unique capabilities would be utilized to their fullest extent. Or he could recommend that the Deep Hunter program be discontinued, that officers like Sarah be retired before they became something that humanity might regret creating. In the end, Harrison wrote 2 reports. The official version praised Lieutenant Chen's exceptional service and recommended her for immediate promotion to Lieutenant Commander. The classified addendum, marked for the eyes of the highest levels of naval command, contained his concerns about the psychological cost of creating such efficient killers. But as he sealed the classified report, Admiral Harrison couldn't help but wonder whether it was already too late. The ocean had already begun creating its own breed of warriors, people like Sarah Chen who belonged more to the depths than to the surface world. The question was whether humanity was prepared to deal with the consequences of what they had unleashed.
6 months later, Admiral Harrison received word that Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen had been given command of her own submarine, the USS Phantom. Her first mission was classified at levels so high that even he didn't have access to the details.
All he knew was that enemy naval forces in the Pacific had begun reporting encounters with a vessel that seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost, leaving destroyed ships in its wake, and survivors who spoke of seeing a skull and crossbones symbol moments before their vessels were sent to the bottom. The legend of the ghost had become reality, and Admiral Harrison couldn't decide whether that represented humanity's greatest triumph or its most terrible mistake.